and the Middle Ages is a term coined by historians to describe a period of time spanning from the fall of the Roman Empire to the Renaissance. However, Renaissance writers and artists referred to this period as the Dark Ages because they saw it as a gap between their own era and the Roman Empire. So, was the Middle Ages really such a dark atmosphere? Or were Renaissance writers somewhat biased against previous generations? The key to understanding this lies in focusing on the fundamental dynamics of the medieval world. The fundamental dynamic here is the feudal system, which is evident in the daily lives of medieval people and ties the entire structure together. Therefore, to understand the Middle Ages, one must first look at daily life. In the year 1000 AD, when Europe's population was about 35 million, it had reached 80 million by 1347. Current calculations show that this explosion was caused by the rural population, as by this time the rural population in Europe had reached almost 90%. The vast majority of these peasants were bound to a lord, obligated to provide labor or various services. This practice became increasingly common, especially in Northern Europe, and formed the basis of class relations. First and foremost, it must be acknowledged that the medieval world was a dangerous place. Throughout this period, wars and invasions shaped Europe. The developments that shaped Europe during this one-year period were primarily wars and invasions. This characteristic structure that Europe gained during the Middle Ages will eventually lead to the emergence of massive stone structures that have reached our present day. These massive structures are called castles and gain momentum, especially from the 9th and 10th centuries. The most important factors were Viking raids and the endless conflicts of rival lords. Castles provided people with a refuge where they could protect themselves in this violent environment. Therefore, soon after, a town developed around every castle, and later, the walls expanded to include the houses, shops, and churches outside, thus forming the cities of modern Europe. For example, York in England was a city that developed in this way, and its strong walls made it one of the wealthiest cities in the region. Like cities, the most prominent feature of village life was that the individuals comprising it were merchants, craftsmen, and artists. The activities of these individuals were closely monitored by administrative units called guilds. Guilds provided new apprentices to shops, and these apprentices would eventually gain experience over time to become guild members. Nevertheless, the economy of medieval Europe was shaped not by cities, but by villages developing amidst cultivated fields and pastures. In a village center, there were barns, warehouses, barracks, animal pens, and houses, the vast majority of which consisted of farmers and their families. The life of villagers mainly revolved around working in the fields for the majority of the year and growing crops for the following year. Harvest times were determined by the church, and times outside of this allowed villagers and lords to have leisure. The land to be cultivated and harvested was divided into specific strips by the church or castle administration. Each strip was assigned to individual villagers, thus determining everyone's tasks. A medieval peasant was typically tasked with growing staple food items such as rye, oats, peas, and barley throughout the year. Their harvest was done with the help of sickles or scythes. While each villager and their family were responsible for their own strip of land, the plowing of fields was a shared responsibility. Homes formed the center of daily life in medieval Europe, and these homes were so primitive compared to modern homes that they couldn't be compared. The floors were generally made of earth, and the limited number of windows restricted the amount of light and fresh air entering inside. Nearly every house had a stable, leading to an intertwined life between humans and farm animals. Towards the end of the Middle Ages, the homes of villagers were evolving. During this process, the construction of additional floors on top of the ground became characteristic of medieval homes. However, even in wealthy homes, comfort was not easily accessible. Heating was always a problem in homes made of stone for the floors, roofs, and walls. There was also an issue with lighting. Small windows prevented sufficient light from entering inside, while all base candles left a sharp smell in the house. Under the roof covering of the houses, there were wooden benches, long tables, cupboards, and beds inside the homes. Additionally, medieval peasants had to eat to sustain themselves. Generally, they were nourished with bread made from wheat, oats, or barley. In addition to this, meat stew, vegetables, and bread were common foods found on the peasants' table, although they rarely had the opportunity to eat meat. The high consumption of wine and beer limited the daily water consumption. Although the household of peasants was quite limited compared to today's standards, during the Middle Ages, some wealthy peasants had slaves in their homes. In addition, hiring paid workers was quite popular. In medieval Europe, it was a common practice for young people to earn money by working in other people's homes, seen as a natural cycle of life. In this way, young people learned the skills they would need later in their lives. As we move away from village life in the Middle Ages, we encounter a new way of life forming behind cold castle walls. Nobles and knights could suddenly acquire land by being granted land by another lord, even if they didn't own land. The feudal system was built on the exploitation of land and peasants. In the 11th and 12th centuries, land began to be inherited from father to son. Before this time, land was shared among all siblings, but from this time onwards, only the eldest brother had rights over the land. The heavy knight's military services, castle controls, tax collection, and maintaining positions were built on land control. In the Middle Ages, the noble class was divided into layers internally. Kings and high-ranking nobles had serious power over ordinary people as well as other nobles. The nobles below them had less land and less say over people. They were found in a lower stratum than other nobles. Typically, they did not own any land and were obligated to serve another lord. The households of kings or high-ranking nobles were much larger compared to the households of other classes. The etiquette and hierarchical structure of the Middle Ages were shaped around this large household. The larger it was, the more rigid the hierarchy became. For instance, certain uniforms had to be worn in the castles of some nobles. These uniforms indicated the class to which the individual belonged. The daily life of nobles was often filled with various activities, such as playing board games similar to chess, hunting, listening to music, and attending feasts. In the castles of the Middle Ages, the residence area of nobles featured a large hall decorated with tapestries hung on the walls. Benches other than the lord's throne were placed here. At night, these benches and the floor of the hall served as beds for the servants. Some castles had a separate part of the hall called the minstrel's gallery, which was often used by musicians and singers to perform during evening meals. The fireplace, invented by the Normans during their dominance in Europe, quickly became an indispensable part of castles. Prior to this period, fires were made in the middle of the hall, thus requiring smoke to be vented within the castle. However, with the addition of chimneys by the Normans, this problem was solved. The Lord's Solar, a room with large windows and surrounded by curtains on all sides, contained a large bed. On the top floor, there was a room where the lady of the castle and her servants handled their daily tasks. This room had the largest windows of the castle and thus offered the widest view. From around 1250, glass panes were added to these windows. The royal lifestyle was quite busy for everyone. Young nobles often received their education in different courts of castles. Here, they learned the basic things needed for every question of the Middle Ages, such as reading and writing, alongside their studies of divine matters. After this, they served as a squire until they reached the age of 18 and were knighted through a religious ceremony. Although vegetables were heavily consumed in medieval castles, they never formed the main meal. Meat was always present on the dining table, with the most consumed being meats of swan, peacock, magpie, and wild boar, often presented with gold leaf for ostentation. Contrary to what is shown in films, tournaments held in castle gardens were staged combat displays. Especially around the 12th century, jousting became quite common. Additionally, hunting was an indispensable activity for every knight. Fashion sense among nobles became quite elaborate, especially in the late Middle Ages. Sleeves grew larger and shoes diversified. During these years, men's fashion almost competed with women's fashion. The lives of nobles were now adorned ostentatiously.
A medieval knight, lord, or lady enjoyed being in the limelight. However, throughout the Middle Ages, there were also modest lives lived behind closed doors. This lifestyle was embraced by monks. The life of a medieval person was shaped around the 37 principles they acquired during their education. These were vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, where monks declared that they renounced the pleasures of worldly life according to these vows.
Their new life would largely revolve around serving in the monastery and its surroundings. Monks spent most of their days in worship, prayer, reading, and manual labor. They read sections from the Bible for hours and devoted the remaining time to monastery chores. Monks were also responsible for the use of land. Therefore, they engaged in planting and harvesting tasks and produced wine, beer, and honey. In addition to all this, monasteries were centers that worked for the benefit of society and served as charitable institutions. The Middle Ages, as it spread over that period, is not easy to simply confine and define according to those who lived within it. Manuscripts that have reached us are full of descriptions of different lives lived during the same periods. For example, the medieval life described by Ausonius and Apollinaris Sidonius in the 6th century is filled with tennis matches, warm family conversations, and intimate friendships established during dinner parties. However, Fortunatus Gregorius Motorlu, writing in the same century, presents a different scene of suffering under invasions. Therefore, the Middle Ages are divided into many layers, both temporally and spatially. It is not easy to extract a concrete picture from these layers and present it in its simplest form. Here, the life of a medieval person will always be somewhat accurate and unknown to modern humans. Perhaps that's why the medieval person will always remain mysterious to us.